Good morning, good morning, good morning. How are we all? And welcome to session 3, all about the Great Fire of London. And this week, what we're going to be looking at is how do we actually know about the Great Fire of London? Because it's such a huge event in history. But how do we actually know what went on? So last week, we kind of looked at what happened. We looked at the fact that the fire spread very quickly, mainly due to the timber construction of the houses. And the fact that they were very close together and there were lots of overhangs. We looked about the fact that the mayor didn't take it very seriously, which allowed it to spread. We also talked about the fact that there was a big wind that was blowing, and we talked about whether or not the fire was inevitable. Now we're going to think about how do we actually know about the Great Fire of London. How do historians know? Because, of course, it happened in 1666, which was a very long time ago. Now, my first challenge to you is this. Can you make up your own 2 or 4 line rhyming poem to share what you've learned so far? So I'm going to give you maybe a minute. So a really famous one is in 1666, London burnt like rotten sticks. So can you come up with your own 2-line, or if you're super good at rhyming, your own 4-line rhyming, I don't know if you'd call it a poem because it's only sort of 2 lines of what you've learned so far. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to do it, 1 minute to get your thinking hats on. Can you think of something a bit like in 1666, London burnt like rotten sticks? Can you come up with your own? Are you ready? I'm glitching. I hope I'm not glitching for everybody. I froze. Hopefully I'm okay. So I'm going to say it again. In 1666, London burnt like rotten sticks. I'm going to give you 1 minute for you to write your own. So if you're over on Facebook, feel free to add it into the chat. If you're over on YouTube, you can jot it down, and this could be the start of a really big poem. So we've got in 1666, Londoners wished they'd built with bricks. That's a really good one. There was a great big London fire that melted the cathedral spire. Absolutely, because that's another really good point, that was made with bricks, but it's still burnt because that's not the only sort of aspect to it, was it? In 1666, London fell like sticks. The fire started in Pudding Lane. London would never be the same. Wow, these are awesome. We put them all together, and then you could learn all about the Great Fire of London from these. Absolutely amazing. So what we're going to be looking at today is we are going to be looking at how we kind of know about the Great Fire of London. And we're going to be looking at various sources of information. So that's what historians do. So in order to learn about the past, they look at lots and lots of what we call sources, which is just bits of information. And when you look at a piece of evidence or source, whatever you want to call it, evidence, source, it doesn't matter. As a historian, you have to think about 2 things. You have to think about, is this useful? And the second thing you have to do is think about, is it reliable? Can I trust it? Now, those 2 things are incredibly different because it might not be reliable at all, but it can still be useful because it can still tell you. So, for example, you could read something that somebody's written that wasn't, was really not what other people think, which would make it unreliable, but it's still useful. And so that's what you judge it on. So the first thing to think about is what does useful mean and what does reliable mean? So, for example, if I was going to learn about the Great Fire of London, looking at a modern fire engine is neither useful nor reliable. But if I looked at, for example, some written evidence about it, that somebody had written down that was there at the time, I would say maybe that's useful, but not necessarily reliable. So what does useful mean and what does reliable mean? So what do they mean? What does useful and reliable mean? So if something's useful, what does that mean? And if something's reliable. So you might want to think about the root word. What's the root word of useful? What's the root word of reliable? So yeah, absolutely. If something's useful, it means it's helpful. It means it's helpful to help you learn. So that's definitely what useful, because the root word of usefulness is use. So it means that you can use it. So as I said, I can't really use a modern day fire engine to learn about the Great Fire of London. What does reliable mean? Well, the root word of reliable means rely. You can rely on it, which basically means you can trust it, or can you trust it? Because that's what you should be thinking about. But even if it isn't reliable at all, it still could be useful. So you might look at something and think, wow, this doesn't fit with anything else I know about an event, but so it's not very reliable, but it could still tell me about something. So, for example, someone might have written a whole pile of lies about the Great Fire of London, and it won't fit with anything else. But it might be useful to learn about, well, why did they write something that wasn't reliable? Does that make sense? So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at lots of bits of evidence that we have about the Great Fire of London, and we're going to think about whether or not they're useful and whether or not we can trust them. So the first thing I'm going to say to you or ask you to do is, what evidence do we have of the Great Fire of London? If we were going to go and look in I don't know, a library, or we were going to look in a museum, or we're going to write our own book all about the Great Fire of London. What evidence do we have of it occurring? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds, chat to the person at home. Can you write me a list? Can you come up with at least 3 things that you think we may have, 3 bits of evidence that we may have that might help us know about the Great Fire of London? Well, can you let her out, please? Okay, so let's have a look what we've got. So we could look at written accounts. We could maybe look and see if we can find any sort of information from the soil. So if you ever did the Romans with me, you know that in certain cities that Boudica burnt to the ground. You can see what's known as the Boudica layer. We could maybe look at some maps. We could maybe look at some sketches. We could maybe see if we've got any ruins left. Absolutely. Any more ideas of what we could look at? You've got loads of ideas of what we could look at. Any more ideas? What could we look at? Shall we share them? So definitely we've got this one. Lots of people going, they don't know. Don't worry, you don't have to know. We could look and see, were there any eyewitness accounts? Was anybody interviewed after the event? Did anybody say what they saw, and was it written down? So that's the first thing we could look at. Another thing we could look at is the census. So a census happens every few years, and it documents streets, places, who was living there, what their occupation was, and so we could definitely look at census data. We could look at letters. Did anybody write any letters to anybody about the Great Fire of London? Can we use those? We could look at paintings. Did anybody see the Great Fire of London and then paint it? Because obviously they didn't have photographs in those days. Was anybody keeping a diary? So did anyone write down what they were seeing? Okay, a census, so they go look up what a census is. So a census is what happens, I think it might be every, I'm not sure, 4 years? I'd have to look it up. It's every certain amount of years, and in it you've basically, it documents kind of who you are, what your occupation is, how many young people live. It can't be every 4 years because I don't remember doing one for quite a while. Maybe it's every 10 years. But basically it documents, so you can go and look at census data. So if you're trying to maybe map your family tree, census data is something that you can use because you can literally trace people back through time. Okay, so a census, maybe it's every 10 years. You basically record who you are, where you live, who lives with you, what your job is, those sorts of things. So that's what a census is. So we could also use diaries. Some of you are saying they have a diary. We could look at maps. So we could look at the maps of London. Did anybody record, you know, the bits that were destroyed? We could look at archaeological evidence. So that's what some people have said. Could we look at the layers of the soil and see evidence of it? And someone else has just mentioned this as well. We could use newspaper reports. So there's lots and lots of things that we can use to learn about the Great Fire of London. So the next thing to think about is, do you think these are going to be reliable? Or do you think these are going to be unreliable? So which ones of these do you think are going to be fairly reliable? And which ones of these do you think maybe might be a little bit unreliable? So have another think. It's tricky, isn't it? Why might, for example, a diary entry be more reliable than, I don't know, an eyewitness account or a letter? What about a newspaper? Is a newspaper reliable or might that be unreliable? What do you think? Which do you think might be the most reliable? What do you think might be the least reliable? So so Jaden's saying that eyewitnesses are reliable. I would argue different. I think an eyewitness account might be a little bit unreliable. Why might an eyewitness account be unreliable? Archaeological evidence is reliable. Yeah, you can't really argue with that, although you can interpret it maybe differently. Do we think newspapers are reliable? If I go and read in a newspaper today, do we think that that's going to be 100% reliable? Because some of you are saying it's reliable, some of you are saying it isn't. It's really tricky. So that's what we're going to look at, because some of these things are fairly reliable. Some of these things probably aren't as reliable as possible. Letters may not be quite reliable. And we're going to look at that. If you're thinking, oh, I don't know, because you do get different accounts because it depends on different people's points of view. Absolutely. It's a really difficult one, and being a good historian is trying to compare evidence and work it out. Because, for example, if everybody went to a football match, so if we all went and sat in a football match, and then we all wrote down our eyewitness account of that football match, everybody's account would be different. And depending on who you sort of supported, your view of the match would be completely different as to whether it was a positive event or a negative event. So that's what we're going to look at. But they're all probably quite useful. They all probably give us lots of things that are quite useful. Oh, this annoying thing has happened again. That's going to annoy me. So let's see if this is going to work. Right, that's a bit better. That does make me cross. So the first thing we're going to look at is we are going to look at a newspaper report from the time. So this is what the newspaper said. The newspaper said, at about 2 o'clock this morning, a sudden and lamentable fire broke out in this city, beginning not far from Thames Street near London Bridge. It continues still with great violence, and hath already burnt down to the ground many houses thereabouts. The king has given orders that all possible means should be used for quenching the fire or stopping its further spreading. So that is from a newspaper report at the time. So what do you think? How useful do you think that is out of 10? How useful do you think that is out of 10? What does that tell us? What does that teach us? What does that teach us, that newspaper report? So some of you are saying kind of 5. So why is it useful? So Jack's saying 7. So it's showing us, it's quite useful because it gives us a rough time. So it's saying it happened sort of around about 2 o'clock in the morning. It says that it's incredibly violent. So it's sort of really dangerous fire. It tells you that the king is involved because he says that it should be stopped by all possible means. And it gives you a date. So it's kind of quite good. You probably couldn't write a book about it, but it does give you some specific details, I think, in some of you. And actually, there's no real opinion there. So I think you do have to be very careful with newspapers if they're starting to give opinions. But I think, it's fairly useful. Someone's given it 0 out of 10. I think it's fairly useful for giving us some basic details about it. Okay, this is going to really bug me. So what I'm going to just really quickly, apologies everybody, I'm going to just delete these because, see, I should have practiced this beforehand because these are all like really annoying that they don't seem to want to leave. Right, bear with, talk amongst yourselves. Right, let's go for the next one. So this is John Morgan, and this is what he says. So he was asked, oh, you saw the Great Fire of London, what happened? And this is what a person called John Morgan says. So he says, I was in a friend's house in Fiott Lane, London, on the 3rd of September in the year 1666. I desired to go to the house to see how near the fire was. I went in with some folks of the house to their garret, which is an attic. Standing there with the folks a little while there, then came a wild fireball by my ears. It fell fiercely into the corner of the room and pierced a hole in the floorboards. It fell to the bottom and then presently it went up in smoke and flames of fire. So what do you think, how useful do you think this is? Now let's look at the date. It says an account from John Morgan in 1668. So someone's already worked it out. It's from 2 years after the event. So they might not be remembering the event properly. How useful do you think it is? Well, I think it's fairly useful for showing how quickly the fire did sort of, start. But it's a bit sensational, isn't it? It is a bit dramatic. So yeah, so I was in this person's attic and then this fireball came crashing past me and it made the whole place envelop in flames. Is that likely? Well, do you think that the fire would have been pretty close before he arrived at his friend's house? And probably he would have gone, oh, maybe that's not a good idea. So I do think that this is a little bit dramatic. I do think potentially it's sensationalised. It's fairly good, though, I think, for learning about how quickly the fire went. But yeah, it might be a bit exaggerated to big himself up. How do you know it's a real newspaper from that time? Because we have in the archives copies of that newspaper. So you can actually go, if you go online, because I can't show it to you because it's held by a museum, and so therefore the photographs of it are copyrighted, but you'll be able to see it because it's held in an archive. So that's how we know it's a real newspaper from that time. But it's still pretty useful. Now, we talked about the census. Now, one type of census that was occurring in 1666 was that people had to record how many hearths they had. Now, a hearth is a bit of a posh name for a fireplace. And so along Pudding Lane and Fish Alley, I think it's called, these are the people, some of the people that were living there. So we can see that there's Mary Whitaker, and she was a widow, so she didn't have a job. and she had 2 fireplaces. And then we have George Porter. His job was a plasterer. He has 3 fireplaces. There was Thomas Knight, glazier, and he was a glass maker, and he had 4 fireplaces. We've got John Bibby. He was a turner, so somebody that turns and carves wood, like to make fancy like chair legs. We've got Thomas Farriner, who is a baker, and he has 5 fireplaces plus an oven. There's William Ludford, who was a plasterer. He had 3 fireplaces. John Wardley, who was a cloth worker, who had 4 fireplaces. And William Walter, who was a blacksmith, who had 3 fireplaces. So basically, you had to pay tax to the king based on how many fireplaces that you had. And these are the tax records, so a bit like a census, of all of the people around Thomas Farriner, who we know that Thomas Farriner's bakery is the one that went up in flames at the beginning. So how useful do you think this particular bit of evidence is? What does it tell you? It's reliable. It's definitely reliable because it's factual. Someone would have gone around and gone, right, you've got 2 fires, you've got to pay this amount of tax, you've got 5 tyres, you've got to pay this amount of tax, you've got 3 fires, you've got to pay this amount of tax. What does it tell you? So lots of you are saying, oh, you think it's about a 5 or a 7. What can you learn from this? What can you learn? Well, yeah, so Thomas Farriner's bakery was the source of the fire, absolutely. Did he start it? Well, we'll talk about that in another lesson. Was it an accident? Was it on purpose? June reckons an 8 out of 10. Well, I think this is fairly useful, and the reason I think it's quite a blacksmith is somebody that shoes horses, and does any sort of iron sort of work. So they might fix railings or gates at that sort of time. I think it is useful. So it's reliable. Jack, I think the word you're looking at is useful. It's useful because it tells you roughly, the size of the houses and their occupations. And that's why, absolutely, it is, we would use the term farrier rather than blacksmith. Absolutely. Exactly like a farrier, blacksmith, they're kind of fairly interchangeable. And the reason I think this is quite useful is because it shows you all the different occupations. Now, lots of people wrongly assume that this area was just bakeries, but it absolutely wasn't. There are lots of jobs here. There's people that plaster walls and things. There is a baker. There's people working with wood. There's people working with glass. There's blacksmiths. There's people working with cloth. So I actually think that it's really, really, really useful for learning about the kind of makeup of the area. Yes, a blacksmith tends to make their own tools for their own jobs, and they would mend other people's tools. Absolutely, there's kind of quite an important job in those days. So I think that's fairly useful. Now, there was another famous diarist at the time. His name was Samuel Pepys. This is what his diary said. So his diary says, Jane came and tells me that she hears that above 300 houses have been burnt down tonight by the fire we saw, and that it is now burning down all Fish Street by London Bridge. It begun this morning in the King's Baker's house in Pudding Lane. I saw everybody endeavouring to remove their goods and flinging them into the river. I saw poor people staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them, and then running into boats or clambering from one pair of stairs by the waterside to another. So how useful is this one? What do you think this one tells us? What does this one tell us? Is this quite useful? So it tells us the location, that it was kind of Fish Street, Pudding Lane, near to London Bridge. It tells us it gives us a figure, but I think that figure is pretty useless because this was at the start, so this is about 300. It is very descriptive, so it gives us lots of information about some of the people staying in their houses, worried that their houses were going to be affected, but only running out at the last minute. People throwing their stuff into the Thames to try and sort of protect it from the fire. So yeah, I think it's fairly useful. It's written at the time as well, so I think that it's not being brought out of memory. And the other thing is with a diary, you don't really have any need. It's your view, but you don't have any need to exaggerate. It is sad, but it's also very descriptive. And it's very much the human side of it, because he went and viewed this. So he heard, so Jane, I don't know who Jane is. Maybe it's his servant, maybe it's his wife. I don't actually know. But he goes and views it with his own eyes, and this is what he wrote down. And as I said, he's writing in his diary, so he doesn't really need to kind of over exaggerate, I don't think. So actually, I would say this is probably more reliable than the guy that was giving an eyewitness account from 2 years later. Okay, does that make sense? It's his maid. Thank you, Jack. It's his maid. Right, here is a painting. This is our next source. So this is a painting. It's a painting from 1797. So that's 131 years after the Great Fire of London. Do we think that this is reliable? Do we think it's useful? What do we think about this one? What do we think? So we can see lots of people on the boats, on the Thames, and trying to sort of row away. We can see the fire. We can see St Paul's Cathedral in the background, which is what got burnt down. What's the problem with this one? What's the problem with this? There's quite a huge problem with this. It is sad, absolutely. But it's not particularly useful or reliable. Why is it not useful or reliable? Yes, it's too late. It's not at the time. There's, it's 131 years after. It is an amazing painting, I absolutely agree. But actually, the person who painted it wasn't even alive when the Great Fire of London happened. Exactly, they weren't alive. It is amazing it's an amazingly painted image, but it's not really going to help us at all because it's just someone's view of a story. So I could tell you a story. You could go paint your own painting, but does it make it reliable, useful? No, it doesn't really. Here is a map. So this one's been based on which areas were destroyed. So it's a modern map that has sort of used evidence to plot what was destroyed. So do you reckon this is useful? Do you think this is helpful? What do you think? So the red is the first bit, the orange is the next bit, the next following day, and then all the yellow bit is roughly the full extent of the fire. What do we think? Well, I think it's fairly useful, and the reason I think it's fairly useful is because you can see roughly where the devastation is. However, someone's saying that it might be slightly inaccurate because we can't entirely be sure exactly the boundaries. But yeah, definitely it does help you put it into perspective. So I think this is probably fairly useful to get a visual idea, put it into perspective, but I would say the boundaries probably aren't definite. So this is the next thing. What evidence do we have of the Great Fire of London? And the answer is not a huge deal. So we don't have a lot. We have, as I said, a few eyewitness reports, which you can say potentially, which were done several years later. We have Samuel Pepys's diary, which he wrote a few times in that about the Great Fire of London. And we have a couple of newspaper articles that were written at the time, and not really a great deal else. A few proclamations from the king of what the king wrote, but actually there is very little evidence of the Great Fire of London. And so it's really interesting to think this is a huge part of history. We don't really even know how many people died. Historians actually believe that probably more people died than were actually ever recorded as dying. The other thing is we don't, and someone was saying, oh, did Thomas Farriner, is that where it started? Well, again, we don't really know, because there's lots and lots of debate. Was it started on purpose? Was it an accident? Like, not lots of people really know. And actually, most of our evidence is very, very small. And so I think it's quite interesting to know that actually we look at something like this huge, huge event, like the Great Fire of London, and we actually know very, very little, other than the huge devastation that it caused. And so I think it's very interesting to say, well, it was certainly an accident, because who would mean to set London on fire? Well, that is something that we are going to look at, because there is lots of suggestions that it was done on purpose. So actually, there is an interesting, I watched an interesting interview with the London, somebody from the fire brigade, and they were saying that if they were investigating arson, which is like willful setting things on fire, that their opinion was the Great Fire of London actually fitted all of the bill, because it was set in the most cramped area of London, and it was a very, very hot summer and very dry. It was perfect conditions with the wind, and actually, if you were an arsonist, that would be the perfect time to set something on fire. But lots of people still maintain it's an accident. Nobody will ever know. But was it an accident, or was it set on purpose? We will start to look at that as we go through into future lessons, actually, because it's quite a tricky one. Yeah, definitely don't think Thomas. I don't think Thomas Farriner did it on purpose, but there's lots of evidence maybe. Well, yeah, build a time machine. Right, we're going to finish off by having a true and false quiz. So my first fact I'd like to decide, is it true or false? Thomas Farriner was a baker to the king. He didn't actually bake any bread, but instead he made dry, hard biscuits for the navy. Do you think that's true, or do you think that's false? No, Thomas Farriner didn't die. He got out. The only person in his household that died was the maid. Thomas Farriner was a baker to the king. He didn't bake any bread. Instead, he made dry, hard biscuits for the navy. Do you think that's true, or do you think it's false? Oh, drum roll. It's actually true. So he didn't actually. You think about bakers, you think about him making lots of lovely bread, but actually he didn't. If you've ever heard the term hardtack, that's what he made, dry, hard biscuits. The first victim of the fire was the baker's maid, who died because she was too frightened to climb out of the top floor of the bakery. So we know from week 1 or week 2 that the maid was the first victim of the fire. But do we think it was because she was too frightened to climb out of the top floor of the bakery? So what do we think? Oh, lots of you are saying true. It is true. So she was apparently scared of heights, and despite everybody, Thomas Farriner, encouraging her out, she was too frightened to climb out, and so sadly she was the first victim of the fire. Many foreign people were attacked in the aftermath of the fire as people looked for someone to blame. So do we think that that's true, or do we think that's false? Yeah, I'd rather break a leg than die. But maybe fear. Fear is huge. What do we think? Do you think this is true, or do you think this is false? A bit of a mixed one. This is also true. And so the belief was from lots of people who'd lost everything were looking for people to blame. And so anybody that was, that was living in London that was from abroad, lots of French people were quite often, and Dutch, because Britain has been at war with the Netherlands for a while as well. People were looking for people to blame, and so people were saying, "Oh, well, it must have been set on fire on purpose." And there were lots and lots of problems with people being attacked in the streets because people were saying, well, you're French, you're to blame for the fire. And so there was a bit of anarchy and mob rule after the fire. The Great Fire of London didn't start on Pudding Lane, but a small area just off Pudding Lane known as Fish Yard. Do you think that's true, or do you think that's false? Yay, someone says they finally got one right. Awesome. Do you think that's true, or do you think that's false? Right, drum roll. It's actually true. So Thomas Farriner's bakery was in this sort of, it's kind of Pudding Lane, but it's actually an offshoot of Pudding Lane, and it's known as Fish Yard. So that's really interesting. So if you really want to be really pernickety, didn't really start on Pudding Lane, actually started in Fish Yard, which is like a little corner. Yeah, if you sort of, you know, like when you go into old cities, they often have those little like alleys and like these little areas. Well, that is Fish Yard, and that is where it actually started. But we kind of say Pudding Lane because that was the main street. But it actually started in Fish Yard. Samuel Pepys, who is the diarist that we looked at earlier, buried a wheel of Parmesan cheese in his garden because he was so worried that the fire might destroy it. What do we reckon? Do we reckon he buried his cheese? Yes, it is. It is true. So let's have a think. If you were worried about your house, what would you go bury in the garden? Well, Samuel Pepys, he went and buried a Parmesan cheese. So there we go. So as he went, that's one of the things he did. So we've read about him going out and viewing the fire and wondering whether or not it would get close to his house. And as the fire got closer and closer and he got worried, he did bury his Parmesan cheese in the garden. But what I would really like to know is whether or not he went back and ever found it, or whether or not it was any good. I don't know, but there we go. Don't think I'd be burying Parmesan cheese or any cheese in my garden, but there we go. So I hope that that session was interesting. But I think the big thing is always never trust what you see or read. You've always got to judge it. And I think I'm hoping that's the first learning point. I hope the second learning point of this session is that we actually have very little evidence about the Great Fire of London, which is quite interesting to think about. So we have our planning guide, which is in the copy somewhere, depending on what platform you'll be watching on. Go and download it if you haven't already. Go and complete any of the activities, and if you do, then do go and share them over on our Facebook group. I am going to say goodbye. However, I am going to finish up by sharing with you a little video from Kirsty, because Kirsty is doing a special live on Thursday morning for a lovely celebration of books. So I'm going to say goodbye and leave you with this lovely little information all about Kirsty's special live on Thursday, all about books, and I'll see you next week.
Do you have a favourite book? Perhaps you have lots of favourite books. Have you ever thought, how did the author get the idea for this book? What makes a book really great? How do writers create such brilliant characters? Join our special live lesson on Thursday morning at 9:30. We'll chat about our favourite books and complete some fun book challenges too. Let's celebrate our favourite books. See you there.
So have a lovely week. I will see some of you for materials tomorrow. Don't forget to check out Kirsty's live on Thursday. Tegan sent me a fact. I haven't seen it, but I will go back and have a little look. Have a lovely week, and I'll see you soon.